Welcome to the AI+HI project. I'm Alex Alonso, SHRM's Chief Data and Analytics Officer. This week, we're discussing the rising challenges of fraud in employment, credential verification, and compliance. Today, we'll be highlighting the intersection of AI and self-sovereign verification and how verified credentials are reshaping trust in the workplace. Our guest this week is Zain Zaidi, founder and CEO of TransCrypts, one of the startup companies in SHRM's Workplace Tech Accelerator 2025 cohort. Welcome to the AI+HI project, Zain.
Hi, Alex. Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you here, and I'm looking forward to having a deep conversation with you about these types of issues, especially these that are so central to most of us in the HR space who are trying to understand specifically how we can verify key credentials for our potential workforces. One of the things that I am grateful for, Zain, in my role as a member of the SHRM Labs Investment Committee is the ability to kind of meet founders like you who have fantastic origin stories, have these kind of really cool kind of ways in which they identified their niche and where it is that they want to go ahead and make their mark on the world. To start us off, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and the story behind TransCrypts? Because it's such a great story, and I'd love to hear more about what motivated you to really go down this path.
Awesome. Yeah. My name is Zain. I'm 25 years old. I've been the co-founder and CEO of TransCrypts for the last 5 years, believe it or not. So created this company right out of college. Our origin stories actually stemmed from my own personal experience dealing with my undergraduate transcript. I was an undergraduate student here in the Bay Area. I studied electrical engineering, and I had gotten admissions into grad school. Grad school wanted to verify my grades and to verify that the grades that I stated on my application were authentic, as is a relatively common process. So they asked me to send over an official transcript from my undergraduate university. So I went to the registrar's office. I paid like a $30 fee and had them send over an official transcript. I go into the summer thinking I'm ready to start grad school in the fall, but about halfway through the summer, I get this big, bold, red email saying, your offer of admissions is in jeopardy. As you can imagine, it was a little bit of a midsummer panic. I was like, what happened? When I read the email, I found out that they never received my undergraduate transcript. So it got me thinking. I had already paid this money to send over my official transcript, but they hadn't received it. So I don't really have control over my credentials. I'm at the whims of my registrar's office to prove that I went to school. And after 4 years and tens of thousands of dollars and many sleepless nights studying engineering, I figured that it was a little bit silly and that there's probably a better way of solving this problem. So I was able to fix that issue and get my admissions back into grad school. But rather than going to grad school, I decided I'd start transcripts.
I gotcha. One of the things is I've had those night sweats, those terrors myself, right? And I say that in large part having graduated from FIU, Florida International University, the state institution down in Miami, and thinking specifically about all the steps that I had to take, those little administrative steps to prove that I had a PhD, right? To prove that I had earned my doctorate. And even the signature pages on the copies that you have to go through with your advisors and your dissertation committee, I still have night sweats about it. And I'm almost 50 now, and have those terrors and thinking about an offer being rescinded or my employment being rescinded in some way, shape, or form. So I share your concern, especially around that big red email that your offer's in jeopardy. One of the things that strikes me is you started off in the higher ed space, right? And then you moved into what it was the employment space. And I'd love to hear a little bit more in terms of your origin story. What caused you to pivot that
Yeah.
to that direction?
Yeah, absolutely. As the name implies, our original focus was university transcripts. What we realized very quickly is that selling to universities is nearly impossible as a small startup. Universities think of onboarding software in semesters. And as a 20-year-old who had funded the startup primarily through credit card debt, I didn't have semesters to figure out whether or not this was a viable solution. About a few months in, we started talking to great group of advisors. And amongst that group was people who work in HR, and they said, you know what? We deal with this pesky issue that we get these inbound verification reference check calls asking us if our employees work here. Is there a way that you can give our employees a document that says this is a valid official proof of employment and proof of income of this employee, and allow that employee to share those records themselves? So me and my co-founder Ali got to the drawing board, and we devised a way to do it for employment and income credentials, and that's been our business ever since.
I appreciate that pivot, and as somebody who's been around the HR space for quite a while, I know that that is something that was almost vexing, is the way to describe it. I just verification in general is something that I think most of us don't think about, but when we think about it, it becomes immediately a head scratcher. One of the things that strikes me is I'd love to hear a little bit about how transcripts approach is unique. What is it that makes it differentiated? Something that is just a whole other aspect that we haven't seen in the marketplace to this point.
Yeah. So our core tenant is data self-sovereignty, and that's a very fancy word for basically a very simple concept. You own your data, and in a age where big tech companies and countless others are always asking us for our data and taking that data and monetizing it, it's kind of a paradigm shift where it's saying, hey, look, we as transcripts, we don't view employee data. We don't, we have no access to it. We are simply the platform where you can verify your own employees' data. But aside from that, we don't do anything else with it. Like, and it's end-to-end encrypted. So that means that even we as administrators of the platform have no access to your employee's credentials. Your employee can also, owns that credential forever and can share it with whoever they want, whenever they want, and however they want. We also use this sometimes loaded technology called blockchain, which is a immutable ledger or database. This basically ensures that we're able to store this record in an immutable way, so that no one can tamper it, right? Obviously, when there's incentive to commit fraud whenever you deal with credentials, it's very important to be able to combat that incentive. And blockchain is one of those really great ways to combat fraud and increase transparency and auditability of any credential on a platform. So that's kind of where our focus and our core technology is, and that's kind of differs us from a lot of our competitors.
What does it look like in terms of the customer journey, though? Talk to me about what it looks like in
Yeah.
terms of, let's say I'm somebody who's applying for a job. How do you guarantee me self sovereignty, so to speak?
Yeah. So we have the biggest and the most primary way that we enable consumers to own their employment credentials is that the company that you work for will reach out to us and we'll onboard them. It takes about 15 minutes to get this whole thing set up. So it's very low weight. Our biggest thing is, we hate change management as much as
Mhm.
everyone else. And we know in HR, change management is one of the big issues. So, we already have all our security certifications. We have everything ready to go. It's actually directly on our website. So we want to make it as easy as possible. All we need is we just integrate directly with your HRS or payroll database. The only reason why we need to do that is because that usually contains the full authentic list of all the employees in your organization with their title. Using that list, we issue out verified credentials to all the employees in your organization, both current and previous. Those employees can then go to transcripts.com, log in with their email, and their credential will be waiting there for them. They can then just click on that credential, click share, type in whoever they want to share it with, and that credential goes up. Our credentials are accepted at over 99.9% of credit unions, banks, landlords, future employers in the country. So chances are that once your employee sends out that credential, it will meet the employment verification requirement for that requesting party.
Hmm. And just so I want to hit upon something that you highlighted for me just in describing that. This notion of controlling and having self sovereignty over your data is really critical, right? I mean, we talk about, obviously there's value in that just from a human perspective, but one of the things that strikes me is in an era of AI where fraud can be so rampant, in particular, not just because of AI and the ability to create or change the ledger, so to speak, the way you've described it. One of the things that strikes me is it's also your data is so powerful and so potent in an AI era because AI is consuming that data repeatedly. So I'd love to hear what you think really makes it so critical and so crucial in thinking about this concept of self sovereign verification.
Yeah. One of the big questions that we get asked nowadays is how do I prevent deepfakes? Right. So, as all of us are eventually going to have deepfakes about ourselves. AI is going to create almost realistic 3D impressions of who we are. There might be, the next year, you might not know if the person that's hopping on the Zoom call with you is actually that person or a deep fake of that person, someone pretending to be that person, right? AI has gotten so good at emulating voice and video that we have no way of knowing who this person is. So I think this makes verification even more important, right? If you know this person and this Zoom account, for example, has a verified credential attached to it, and you get that little verified, check, you'll give you a whole lot more trust in the whole process. So we think in an age of AI where we're kind of headed, where impersonations are on the rise, and it's going to be almost impossible to discern real from fake information. I think verifications are going to be increasingly more important, and that's something that we're actually, as a company, focusing more towards. Is how do we ensure not only do we enable your employees to own and access their data, but how do we also ensure that your employees can protect their identity, their digital identity, and verify who they are in a trusted manner?
Yeah, Lord knows I myself have been someone who's actually been taken by this notion of deepfakes. Not personally, not taken in terms of being duped or anything like that, but obviously we're
Yeah.
seeing an era of deepfake really growing to some degree, right? Hell, if you've been anywhere in the last 8 months, you've probably seen deepfakes in the most unsophisticated way kind of pop up, and at the same time, deepfakes that are as sophisticated as the kind that can lead to massive fraud and massive kind of theft all over the place. So I'd love to hear some examples of what you're experiencing in your own world that really push this.
Yeah, I mean, I heard a story of you know, there was a controller at an organization, and he received a phone call. I think you've probably heard of the story too, and it was the CFO of the business, and the CFO asked him to move a very large sum of money from one account to another external account, and the CFO made it seem urgent. We all get phone calls from our coworkers, and so the controller did it. Turns out that wasn't the CFO. It sounded exactly like the CFO. Someone had gotten enough. The CFO was a public person. They went on into the internet and got enough of their podcast, just like this one that we're doing, and their voice. And they trained an AI model against that voice, and the AI model was able to emulate that voice to an incredibly realistic level, and convinced that controller to send the funds out. So who do you blame in that situation, right? You can't blame the CFO. You can't blame the controller. The controller is just doing what he's told, right? So these are instances that are going to become more and more prevalent as this technology continues to improve, and it's something that I think it's going to be extremely important for organizations to go figure out.
Couldn't agree more. So talk to me a little bit about we're going to pivot a little bit, and I want to talk a little bit about AI, but AI in a positive light. Specifically, I want to hear how it is that Transcripts is leveraging AI in its platform. Are there any specific AI-based technologies or methods that you're really bringing to bear when thinking about this, other than the typical, pat machine learning and different things like that? What are you using these days that actually is being leveraged in your core work and platform?
Yeah. So, we don't use AI as much in our solution as we enable others to use AI on their own data.
Hmm.
So one thing that we've started to do is enabled users to link their credentials with and there's these new solutions that are coming out with their chat GPT and things like that. So they can be able to authentify and prove that, these credentials belong to me, and then have AI train on that data. We don't really necessarily use machine learning and LLMs in-house, mostly because we don't have access to our users' data. So there isn't much to train on our end. That is by design, and according to our mission. But really, the thing that we think about and what keeps us up at night is, we think verifications are as much as AI has amazing use cases and it's going to help improve the world many times over. I think it's also important for companies like ours to exist that help prevent some of the bad use cases from AI from ever fostering. Right. The reality is, it only takes a few of these bad cases for regulation to come in and to slow down innovation. And our goal is to let's stop that from the get go and prevent regulation from coming in, and let's prevent as much fraud as we can as possible. And that's something that we're really focused on.
So you hit upon a term that I think is actually quite valuable here, and I think because people confuse verification with fraud prevention, right? And they're actually two very different things, right? They work hand in hand. But I'd love to hear your thoughts, especially around fraud prevention, because it's such a central pillar of what you all do. How is it that AI, right? You're helping detect fraudulent activity in the verification process using AI. How is it that's coming to life?
Yeah. So for example, like let's say you're a hiring manager, right? And you get 1,000 applications
Mhm.
for your role. About 300 to 400 of those applications are going to be fake. And even more so if you look at that resumes that have you know, uh, to put it nicely, exaggerated information, right? Maybe a job title that isn't true, maybe a previous role that isn't true, maybe a start and end date that isn't true, right? Our goal is how do we bring all that information out to light and help that hiring manager go through these thousands or 1,000 in this instance applications and go down to that 200 applicants that are actually legit, truthful, and so that can help. That's an 80% time saving. So these are things that we're actually like, these are new products that we haven't launched yet, but we're actually experimenting internally with some of our HR team members. How can we help prevent things like resume fraud? How can we improve, timings on, understanding is this application legit? Is it not? Before the background check process, right? Because background checks cost money; they take weeks to fulfill. So how can we ensure that so that when you go and actually offer these candidates interviews, you have a lot more certainty that this person is legit and things like that. So that's kind of an area that we're focused on. And you brought up a very interesting point. Fraud prevention and verifications are synonymous; they don't mean the same thing. A
Mhm.
verified person is a lot less likely to commit fraud.
Mhm.
So that's one of the ways that you can kind of, if you can verify all the users, or if you can verify all your employees, or if you can verify all the inbound job applications, you're more likely than not to get less fraud.
I'll tell you what, what you're describing is a measure of efficiency that I know a lot of my friends in talent acquisition are looking for. I've heard nothing but war stories about both sides of the equation, right? You hear the talent acquisition professional, the recruiter who sits there and says, "Oh my God, we're being spammed with all these fraudulent applications and all these different. How do I get 1,000 people applying in the course of a day for a job that just typically shouldn't get that many applications, right? And at the same time, I also hear the people who are the applicants saying, how do I prevent myself from being drowned out by all these things, right?" And so you see a lot of applicants doing one of two things. One is, how do I differentiate myself in an era where there is all this drowning out happening? And at the same time, also, how do I make sure that I'm spamming the world with my own resume as much as possible so that I'm applying for jobs? All of it leads to inefficiency, right? It leads to inefficiency, and what a nightmare for employers as well as people who are legitimate verified candidates, as you described, trying to achieve the dignity of employment, right, so to
Ex- ex-
speak.
Exactly. I think, the whole hiring process is something that's going to get revamped, and it's probably already going through that revamping. It's just the old thing of here's a online portal, submit your resume. It doesn't work in the age of AI, and as these AI tools become more sophisticated, um, it's just going to become very difficult to be able to discern legitimate applicants from non-legitimate, all the way down to fraudulent applicants as well.
Yeah, it's ripe for disruption, to your point. I think it's absolutely critical there. So today we're in a world of AI generated resumes. What would you say are the biggest challenges that HR professionals and hiring managers are sort of experiencing in these AI generated kind of resume
Yeah.
reviews? And then more importantly, what is it that you think that they can do to kind of leverage tech to overcome that? Obviously, transcripts, but what about other kind
Yeah.
of forms of tech?
Absolutely. So, as someone who also leads HR at our very small company, I can attest to that whenever we have a job application, and we're hardly a large company that gets, probably large companies with brand names probably get many more times the applications that we do, but even in the smallest of postings, we get hundreds, if not thousands of applicants. And it is extremely time consuming to go through it. And, there are ways that exist to automate it, like keyword detection, things like that. Those are imperfect ways. You can ask any hiring manager. You let go of a lot of good candidates, and you still sift in a lot of bad ones. So someone at the end of the day still has to go through these applications. Some of the interesting things that I'm seeing now is actually using AI to counter AI. So people are using, I won't plug any specific names, but there are tools that exist that can go through these resumes for you. and actually give you a much more comprehensive overview of what the candidates, um, job history, and you can even click on external links. So if a candidate has their LinkedIn or their GitHub attached, they'll click onto those links and review those GitHubs and LinkedIn's for you on your behalf. So you get a basically instead of a multi-page resume or even a one-page resume, you get a blurb about this candidate that you can
Mhm.
quickly review and approve or decline. So I think those are some things that are pretty cool, right? Like how do you turn a long one-page, relatively dense resume into a couple sentences
Yeah.
of just the key information that you're interested in? I think that's extremely potent, and it can help save a lot of time and get through a lot of that fluff that exists on resume.
Mhm. It's interesting. I see a lot of that fluff on resumes. I always wonder how it is that the algorithms are really picking up and teasing apart that fluff, right? I say that because I've myself have run a mini experiment from time to time to say, okay, what do you see in this resume versus what do I see? Meaning me, the human. And it's always fascinating how much the AI can pick up that I don't pick up, right? It's sort of funny. I remember I had a boss. I'll never forget this. A former supervisor who used to weigh a resume and say, "This is how I know this person has been prolific." Right? That and the university that they went to. Those were the two criteria that they used. And I said, "How do you know any of that is true?" Right?
Yeah,
And I can put together my Vita. Right, being the academic PhD in the room, right? My Vita could be 83 pages long if I
yeah,
wanted to, right? But how do you know what I actually contributed to that? The 83 pages of fluff, right? So
exactly. Right.
yeah,
I think the one of the big issues that I see is that a lot of times with candidates, they'll be like they'll work for some big company, they'll be like help contribute going from 0 to 100 million in sales. You're like, wow, that sounds extremely impressive. And then you realize there were 35 other people on their team, so it's like yes, you were but one of 35 people who helped contribute to that, right? So it's a lot of getting through to the core of what their contributions is. And it's very interesting. It's very interesting to see how AI can say, hey, you know what, this is a interesting claim, but let's flag it and let's keep it for let's scrutinize it a little bit more.
yeah. One other area that I think it's actually helped me significantly is actually in looking at this notion of the person who claims they're a strategist versus not a strategist and led that strategy. To your point, a team of 35 growing to 100 million is very different than somebody who's actually put together the entire strategy and then had somebody else execute and implement it, right? And so I myself have found that the AI is helpful at picking that apart in many cases by actually picking up on the keywords that somebody is using, or more importantly, also teasing apart what it is that they actually did from a performance perspective with a variety of different assets. Right? Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
Absolutely, and there's some. There was one thing that my co-founder experimented with where we went to some of these sales resources and created an actual org chart of the organization, so you could actually even place where this employee was in the org chart, so you can actually like really weigh. Oh, they were like they were they're relatively junior employees, so they probably didn't contribute a whole lot to this particular initiative that was company wide, for example, right? So you can start understanding, and AI can do this relatively easily now with agents and agentic workflows.
So I'm going to ask you a question here, and I'm gonna ask you to put your futurist hat on, right? Because now we're I want Zane the futurist to be in the room with me here. How do you see verification of credentials and resume information or data evolving as AI becomes more advanced and accessible, right? So like you just referenced agentic AI as an example, right? And I think about agentic AI at the data layer, I think about it at the orchestration layer. How is it that you see some of that evolving, especially in the context of verification of credentials and resume data?
I almost don't see any more digital interactions that occur with non-verified users. So, imagine your Slack channel, imagine your Gmail. You wouldn't receive any more inbound emails from anyone else aside from people who have verified credentials. And the reason for that is that unless you sign up for a newsletter or whatnot, most people don't want to receive emails from ChatGPT or some spamster that's using ChatGPT to generate that email on their behalf. I think it becomes increasingly important in organizations, right? We have organizations that are still very much remote or still have, even if they're in person, still have a big chunk of the day that's in the digital environment. The issue with any of those interactions in that digital environment is that you don't know if your counterparty is actually that party or not that party. And like I mentioned with some of the deepfake examples, it can get really good with even emulating voice, how they talk, how they write messages, things like that. So I imagine in the future where, misinformation and disinformation and fake information are all on the rise. You're going to need to have verified profiles and verified credentials to be able to be certain that the counterparty that you're dealing with in a digital transaction, whether that digital transaction be as simple as receiving or sending an email, all the way out to obviously financial transactions, legal transactions, whatnot, are legitimate. So that's kind of where I see the future. I see, and that's that's one of the great conversations philosophically about AI, right? If AI makes everything if it makes it much harder for you to discern reality online, which it already is, right? There's a lot of videos about you know prominent people and they sound very legit, they look very legit, but then you find out that they're not, they're fake. It will eventually create a world where you don't trust anything online, and therefore people will only want to trust things that come from people that they trust in reality. And the only way to curate and bridge that real trusted profile with the digital profile is through verified credentials and digitally verified identities. So that's kind of where I see the future heading. And I think it's going to become something that's increasingly important as the technology improves. And actually, like, not to sound too doomsday, but I think the entire digital web will actually fall apart if you cannot, if we can't solve this problem correctly. Because the reality is no one will trust anything online. It'll come to a point where anything that you read online, no one will trust it, and that's obviously not a good place to be.
So, it's funny you mentioned that because I like to practice and I like to talk in movies, right? The team knows this, the audience knows this. I like to talk in movies. So, as far as I'm concerned, Skynet is coming. If it hasn't already come, I think it has. And I know that we're going to be batteries in the Matrix at some point, right? Joking, of course. But one of the things that stands out is I would love to hear your perspective because you just alluded to it, right? How do we kind of see and maintain a future? What changes do we need to see to really maintain that future where authenticity and trust remain at the forefront, right? You highlighted that obviously in social world, we're seeing the notion of trust be redefined. It's become a very different animal in terms of what we trust and what is fact, so to speak. Talk to me a little bit about what you see as far as technological changes and innovation that needs to happen to ensure that authenticity and trust are still paramount to employers and to others.
I think there has to be a disclaimer on whenever AI is being used or whenever an AI agent is um, pretending to be a human being. I think you can have an internet where you have a bunch of these bots roaming around pretending to be humans. That's an internet that doesn't work, right? It's almost whenever we read that Instagram comment, whenever we read a Reddit, you always think that there's a human being behind this. It's increasingly becoming where there's a bot behind it, and it's easy to spread misinformation or spread misnarratives or false narratives around certain things by creating those bots and bot armies. And we know that both state actors, corporations, they're all been guilty of using these things. So I think there needs to be these platforms need to come together and say, okay, like, we'll flag whenever a bot is pretending to be a user. You'll say bot next to it. I think also with images and videos, I think there should be some sort of way within these video generation tools and audio generation tools for you to know that this is a AI generated audio, for you to know that this is an AI generated video. I think it's very important. You know, it's you need to flag these things so that people don't believe them. Because once people start believing fake information, then you start getting all kinds of very, very bad outcomes for society that are actually very a lot of political scientists and whatnot, economists have talked about situations where society starts believing in false narratives. It can lead to a lot of bad things happening. So I think this is something it's extremely crucial. Also, a shameless plug. I think with the HR audience, I think the first thing that you can do is incorporate transcripts in your flow so that your employees can actually own a verified credential of who they are. And we're going to continue to work towards building out use cases where those employees can not only share those credentials for real life use cases like mortgages, future jobs, responding to background checks, etc., but also for digital interactions as well.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to kind of share that perspective, that future. It almost gives me chills, right?
Yeah.
Just because I do think there's a kind of a concept that we all need to kind of wrap our heads around in terms of the notion of authenticity and really trust being a continual thing that we've got to build within our tech stack. So I'm gonna round us out here a little bit with one question. It's my curveball that I ask everyone when they are part of this show and this audience, this podcast. One of the things that stands out to me is if you were in a room with the top 50 CHROs of major corporations, small corporations, but the big 50 CHROs, what kind of advice would you give them as far as what their focus should be, but more importantly, what they should be dealing with when thinking about applicant fraud and compliance issues, right? What is it that they're missing that they don't really address today or they haven't really thought about today?
I think the advice that I would give is that, organizations, especially of that size, tend to be slow moving. They're still operating under the previous paradigm, the pre-ChatGPT paradigm, that a lot of what I read online is real. A lot of these resumes have actually been written by human beings, things like that. I think the thing that I will say now is that what we're seeing, especially people in my age and in my generation, is that Gen Z and younger, they're not writing their resumes anymore. They're putting 5-6 bullet points into ChatGPT, and ChatGPT is writing that stuff, and they're not even reviewing the information that ChatGPT is spitting out. So even unintentionally, they might be committing fraud because ChatGPT is going to fill in the blanks with whatever sounds good, and then they're going to submit that to your job. I think you have to really build and understand that in this day and age, we have to be a little bit more proactive with countering that. And there's a new generation of people who are AI first, and while that's good and all, you have to counter that with tools that can help really discern the truth from the fluff and the fluff from the fraud. And I think that's something that's going to become increasingly important as time goes on.
Yeah, when I talk to CHROs, the number one thing I talk to them about is data and understanding the signal from the noise. I
Yeah,
like how you put it, the fluff from the fraud. I
yeah,
really appreciate that and trying to figure out what's actual, truly verifiable and the kind of thing that keeps authenticity at the forefront, to your point. Uh, that's going to do it for this episode. And I'm grateful. Thank you so much, Zain, for sharing your expertise and deep insights with us this week.
Did you know our podcast is only one part of the AI+HI project? We also host an annual event featuring visionaries from the worlds of business, tech, and HR. Plus, we publish a weekly newsletter that includes topical articles and the latest research from SHRM, all to help you stay ahead of the trends. To sign up, just make your way to shrm.org/AI+HI. And you can also follow SHRM on social media for even more clips and stories. Like, share, and tell us how you're innovating towards a brighter future.
SHRM.